This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
We meet regularly for our pipeline meetings. In those meetings, my goal is to help them to move prospects from one stage to another. And I help them think through strategy, help them stay on top of what needs to be done, and prompt them to think about what are the next steps.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. This interview is part of the Career Curious series. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Selene Hur, Manager, Prospect Development and Research at YMCA of Greater Toronto. Hello, Selene. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. Great to be here.
Before we jump into doing prospect research in Canada, I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your career and how you arrived in research.
Sure. Well, my interest started in my undergraduate studies, and I had a lot of work placements in the nonprofit art sector. And after I finished school, I had a couple of years with a boutique consulting firm, again, working with nonprofit organizations. When I finally sort of started my career, it was at Canada's National Ballet School, and it was for a campaign coordinator / stewardship role, as they were just wrapping up a huge capital campaign. I was there for a few years, and about halfway through my time there, I guess I sort of created the prospect research role for myself. And the way it happened was I just noticed that I seemed to be the one with this level of curiosity. So for example, if we had a team meeting and we were preparing for an event, we would run through the names of people who were planning to attend, and someone would ask, oh, I wonder, what this person's spouse does, like where they work. The question would just sort of hang in the air. And I just sort of jotted that question down. I thought, someone's curious about it, so I'll just look it up afterwards. So that's just sort of how it happened. I would just, take questions away from meetings and just do a little bit of research on my own, and then send the team, this question from the meeting, here's the answer, right? And I can't remember how exactly, but I realized that there was a role or an area of fundraising called prospect research. And so I spoke to my supervisor that time, and we had some extra budget. And I was fortunate enough to have some one-on-one training for a couple of days with a leading prospect researcher. From there on, it was sort of like a lot of learning on my own and developing my skills that way. I would attend Canada conferences or sign up for webinars and just learn more and more on my own. After a few years at the National Ballet School, I noticed that the YMCA of Greater Toronto was actually hiring for someone to take on a prospect research and stewardship manager role. This was in 2009. So I thought, oh, this is a really nice mix. It's unusual to have those two portfolios combined. I applied for the role and I got it. And I had the chance to build research and stewardship sort of from scratch at the YMCA, because they were just sort of rejigging their major gifts team. And so I was one of the newest team members there. And I would say that about 6 years ago, my role became more focused on research, and then in recent years has grown to include prospect management. And that's where I am today.
What a journey. And to pair prospect research with stewardship, I think that's kind of brilliant.
Yes, it was two big portfolios combined into one. So I can't say that I did both equally well. So that's why, when I was asked, how would you like to refine your role? Where are you more passionate, or what portfolio are you more passionate about? And I said I would prefer to spend more time doing prospect research. So that's how my role sort of got refined.
That's wonderful. And I couldn't help but notice on your LinkedIn profile that you also speak French and Mandarin. So of course, I'm curious, how did you learn those languages, and are you using them in your research?
Well, I grew up speaking Mandarin at home. My parents thought it was important for their children to be able to speak Mandarin and sort of carry that on as they grew up as a connection to our heritage. So Mandarin is technically my first language, but it was quickly overtaken by English once I started going to daycare. So at one point, I could read and write at the elementary level, but of course now I've lost it because I really don't use it day to day. I only speak Mandarin with my parents and with my sister, and that's not very often. So that's the background with the Mandarin. In terms of French, I took French from grade 4 to 10 because it was a compulsory course for us in school. And then I decided to continue doing it in the last few years of high school, as well as taking on a few courses at university. It was just sort of an interest of mine. And I even benefited from a short immersion experience in France, which really helped with my speaking skills. But unfortunately, just like Mandarin, I don't get to use it very often, and my French is quite rough now. I personally have not made use of my language skills in research because of the level of my proficiency, but I know that there are a couple of researchers, especially at universities and international relief organizations, who have really benefited from their language skills as they explore non-English news or data sources.
Great. Very interesting. I would have thought that everyone would speak French in Canada, but I can see where when that's the case, how kids in school would exactly not want to do it. So I'm curious, as a Canadian researcher, what's a typical day like for you?
It's hard to generalize. I guess I should point out that I'm a solo researcher. So my experience will probably be different from someone who works in a larger development team, but more similar to the experience of a US solo researcher. So each day really varies, and it can be very different depending on the priorities that are going on. And in fact, it's that variety that I enjoy. So, I might start my day scanning the news, and if there are any relevant articles, I'll send them to the team, anything relevant to the fundraising industry or to a donor or prospect that gets shared with the team. I'll have days where I spend a lot of time developing profiles and call briefs for upcoming meetings, or it might be purely really focused research on a particular segment if I'm trying to identify some potential prospects. Then there's also, the beginning of the month or the end of the month, there's a lot of financial reporting. I take care of that for the team when it comes to our capital campaign. And then more regularly, really on a bi-weekly basis, I'll be preparing for our prospect pipeline meetings. So the preparation for those meetings can be quite extensive for me, and it'll involve pulling active proposals, assessing what needs attention or what we need to discuss at that week's meeting. I'll have snapshots completed and ready to present to the team potential prospects that I've recently identified. I would say that the most time-consuming bit of my role, preparing for these pipeline meetings, and of course, everything that falls out of the pipeline meetings, all the follow-up. As well, we recently rejigged our prospect management system. So these days, I'm spending a lot of time, I would say, going down the rabbit hole as I'm exploring reporting options and troubleshooting. We use RE/NXT. So I'm spending a lot of time sort of comparing, what's going on with the database view versus the web view, so that I know what the similarities and differences are, and then I can train my team on it. Part of the reason why I spend a lot of time with the database as well is that our database administration is sort of a shared role between IT and fundraising, and I'm the go-to person for the fundraising perspective or data management piece of it. So that sort of is unpredictable and time-consuming at the same time.
I have to say, your job sounds pretty exciting. You get to do just about everything under the research hat.
That's what happens in a small team.
Exactly. And so typically research is serving like major and planned gifts. Do you also help out with direct appeals or any other areas of fundraising?
Not so much with direct appeals, but in terms of mid-level giving, where there is that one-on-one attention, I do work with that gift officer to do the occasional, research before they get in touch with someone. Or I also do a lot of, when it comes to operations and reporting, because as a small team and we're sort of understaffed right now, I'm sort of filling in the gaps there. And then finally, we have a bit of a staffing gap on the stewardship side. So anything that's data related, in the stewardship area that is like communication contact lists or, donor recognition. So anywhere where there's constituent data involved, I'm involved in it. And like I said, that's sort of what happens with a smaller fundraising team. You just sort of have your finger in all the pots.
That's what makes it exciting in my book. I love it.
Yeah.
Never bored. You're never bored, are you?
That's right.
So tell me a little bit about the major gift officers that you're supporting. How many are there and what's your relationship with them?
We have 3 major gift officers and then our chief development officer, who is obviously involved with major gift fundraising. They all focus on the raising money for the annual campaign as well as our $100 million capital campaign. So I would say that we have a really great relationship. I'm fortunate to have a strong working relationship with them, especially now in this pandemic environment with everyone working from home. We really have a good level of trust and respect. And I think that's so important to the foundation of a good relationship. And it's something that's hard to build without that face-to-face time, that time together in real life, right? But I would say that we have a really good relationship and we meet regularly, as I mentioned before, for our pipeline meetings. In those meetings, my goal is to help them to move prospects from one stage to another. And I help them, think through strategy, help them stay on top of what needs to be done and prompt them to think about, what are the next steps. Sort of a taskmaster, I guess, which I sort of joke about, but they really do appreciate having someone sort of, reminding them about things or bringing something up and pointing out that there's a gap there or, something needs to be done. I also work with another development officer who's in mid-range giving, as I previously mentioned. And for that, it's really just occasional research, and I help her with some prospect management, which is set up the same way in Razor's Edge as what is set up for the major gift team.
So when it comes to the prospect management that you're doing with the mid-level and the major gift, is there anything about your prospect management that you think is unique to Canadian fundraisers, or do you feel like it's a fundamental to fundraising?
This was the one question that took me a while to reflect on, because I was wondering, is there a difference? What can I share with all the listeners? And I realized that really fundraising is fundraising. And I believe the fundamental tactics used to cultivate and manage relationships with prospects and donors are the same. But where the differences lie in prospect management is with the tools that help fundraisers analyze, plan, and execute their tactics. And it's in relation to the scale of prospect management and technology available to support prospect management. I think that's different. So, for example, in comparison to the US, our prospect pools in Canada aren't as large. As well, we don't have as many large institutions with large budgets and sophisticated systems. We might be lucky to have a data analytics person versus a whole data analytics team. So I would say that's where the differences are. I'm always amazed when I attend presentations, whether it's at a conference or it's a webinar, any presentations delivered by a U.S. prospect development professional who works in a large healthcare or higher ed institution. It's mind-blowing what they can produce and what they do to move relationships forward with donors and prospects.
That level of complexity, right? And when there's hundreds of major gift officers, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
My mind gets blown too. So you're not alone out there in Canada. I'm curious what kind of paid tools that you're using for prospect management and research at specifically your institution, as a solo researcher.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I often get calls from vendors asking if I'd like to take a tour of their system and can they spend some time sort of, showcasing their new innovative approaches. And my response is usually, I let them know, sure, I'd be interested in learning about what you have to offer, but I'm a solo researcher. I have a limited budget and I have 2 paid research database subscriptions, and that's all I can afford in terms of money as well as time. I only have a certain amount of time to explore or use these resources. So what I use is primarily iWave, and that's helpful for individual and corporate research in particular, and a little bit of foundation research as well. But specific to foundation research, I subscribe to Grant Connect, which is offered through Imagine Canada. And I know there are lots of other resources that my Canadian peers also subscribe to, and sometimes it's personal preference or just what your budget can allow for. So there are other ones like Charity Can, Aja Fund Tracker, Foundation Search, and the more sort of expensive ones are, Factiva, LexisNexis. There's definitely no shortage of resources for us.
Well, it's interesting to hear what you're using too. It's quite the same over on this side of the border. A small shop might have access to one tool or two because we include foundations. So it's pretty similar. I'm curious, like, for example, in the US, we have real estate records in a way that you don't have in Canada. But is there something you have in Canada, a public record that the US does not have?
I don't believe so. Our privacy laws here are quite more stringent than the laws in the U.S. So researchers in the U.S. definitely have an advantage over us when they're researching their prospects. For the why, I rarely do research on prospects outside of Canada because we're very much focused on the local communities that we serve. And it's mostly people who live and work in the Greater Toronto area who would be interested in our impact. In the rare instances that I perform research on prospects outside of Canada, for example, a Toronto-based prospect who has business dealings or a secondary residence in the U.S., it's one of those eye-opening things or mind-blowing things. I'll jump into iWave and just have a look at what data is available and sometimes wish that we had that same level of information in Canada. But at the same time, I am grateful for our levels of privacy.
Exactly. It's funny to consider yourself as a human being versus a researcher in terms of preferences. Well, before I let you go, I'm wondering if you have any tips for researchers who are outside of Canada on how they could learn more about researching inside Canada.
For sure. I would say the first tip, because it's so easy to get, is to get the book called Prospect Research in Canada, an essential guide for researchers and fundraisers. It was published in 2016, and its production through a volunteer effort and supported by APA Canada. And the editors are Tracy Church and Liz Regman. I can definitely send you a link afterwards so you can share with your listeners. I would also say that there's a recent blog article from 2018 by John Herman, another APA Canada member. And that blog article is called Your Neighbor to the North, Canadian Resources for U.S. Prospect Researchers. And it's a great summary of some resource equivalents on public companies, private companies, wealth screening, real estate, things like that. So that's a really helpful starting point as well. And finally, I would say feel free to network and reach out to a Canadian researcher. Sort of like the U.S. counterparts, I've found that we're all quite open to helping each other and very friendly. And it's just a great community to network in.
Great advice. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your tips and your information. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
That was Selene Hur, Manager, Prospect Development and Research at YMCA of Greater Toronto. That book she mentioned, Prospect Research in Canada, it's the same book I interviewed Tracy Church about in Chat Bites episode number 14. Yep, those were the early days of this podcast. I definitely pull it off my bookshelf for use, and I highly recommend buying it. But now you can also order specific chapters from the book, which is very economical. Look for the link in the show notes. All proceeds go to the APRA Canada chapter. Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come check out the Prospect Research Institute's learning community. It's a membership community with powerful resources, great discussions, and comprehensive courses. Check it out at member.prospectresearchinstitute.org. I'd love to have you join me as a member of the learning community. See you there.